the chill had a peculiar bite that morning. A dry, sharp edge that had not been present in the last weeks of October. Lucas Hale, 30 years old and weathered like an old oak by the Montana sun, felt it settle deep in his bones, a premonition of the true winter that would arrive in weeks. He stood in his woodworking shop, the familiar scent of freshly cut pine and the faint, sweet perfume of heated sawdust clinging to the air like a comforting shroud. The rhythmic rasp of his hand plane against a length of cherry wood should have soothed him, a familiar balm to the anxieties that always hummed beneath the surface of life here. But even the steady rhythm of craft could not quite silence the hum that morning. It had been 5 years, nearly to the day, since the hum had turned into a scream, and the town had not been the same since. This was not a bustling city, not by a long shot. Just a dot on the map, nestled deep in the vast, indifferent wilderness. A collection of tired clapboard houses and brick storefronts clinging to the side of a winding river that ran frigid and clear even in the height of summer. Folks here were quiet, independent, used to the brutal beauty of the land. But after that night, 5 years ago, a different kind of quiet had settled, thin and brittle as ice. Windows on Main Street, once open to catch the breeze, were now often boarded up. The glass had shattered and remained in disrepair after the panic. Old Mr. Henderson, who used to wave from his porch swing, now only peeked out from behind drawn curtains, his eyes darting nervously. Neighbors who had once left their doors unlocked, trusting in the small-town peace, now checked their deadbolts not once but 3, 4, even 5 times before bedtime. Lucas saw it in their eyes, that quick, wary glance over the shoulder, that faint twitch when a twig snapped too loud in the woods. The forest, that ancient sprawling presence that hemmed them in on all sides, had always been their provider, their silent green guardian. It gave them timber, game, clean water. It was where the boys went to hunt deer in the fall, where families gathered berries in the summer. Now, it was different. Now the forest was a gaping maw, teeth glinting in the dark. Children, bundled in their autumn coats, played tag in their yards, shrieking with laughter, only to freeze mid-stride when a distant dog's howl echoed from the trees, and a sudden gust of wind rustled the dry leaves, sounding like a furtive movement. Their innocent games fell silent, their small faces turning to the line of pines and firs, their eyes wide with a fear they were too young to fully articulate, but too old to ignore. Lucas felt the familiar chill that was not from the weather, but from memory. 5 years ago. A blizzard had descended, a howling white madness that swallowed the world whole. The power lines had snapped, plunging the town into a darkness deeper than any they had known. Then had come the other signs. An inexplicable cold that seeped through the very walls of their house, a bone-deep chill that made their breath plume even indoors. The screams from the barns, the rending sounds of flesh and bone, the panicked lowing of cattle cut short. And then the howl, low, guttural, so deep it vibrated in the ground beneath their feet, a sound that froze the blood in his veins and made every hair on his body stand on end. He remembered the chaos, the terror, the monstrous shapes that erupted from the white maelstrom. Large, gray-black, with coarse, shaggy fur that writhed with dark energy, and eyes like molten metal, glowing with a terrible, intelligent hunger. They had torn through the town like a force of nature, but a force with malevolent intent, a predatory grace that defied logic. The most painful part the one that still twisted his gut into a knot of cold dread, was the image of Daniel. His younger brother, barely 18, all gangly limbs and the raw, unformed hope of youth. Daniel grabbing their father's old hunting rifle from above the fireplace, his face pale but set with a reckless courage Lucas had never seen before. "I'll draw them off," Daniel had choked out, his voice thin against the wind's shriek. "Keep Mom and Sarah safe." And then he was gone, a phantom against the swirling snow. For a fleeting second, illuminated by a lightning flash, Lucas had seen it. A dark shadow, impossibly fast, impossibly large, lunging at Daniel. A desperate cry, the sickening sound of a struggle, too brief, too violent, and then an overwhelming, suffocating silence. The blizzard continued its howl, but within its madness, Daniel had simply vanished. His mother's strangled sob, Sarah's small, whimpering cries were the only sounds left in the shattered house. The morning after was a nightmare made real. The town was a charnel house. Houses ripped open, windows smashed, doors torn from their hinges. Dead bodies lay sprawled in the snow, mutilated beyond recognition. The snow around them stained a horrifying crimson. Animals, horses, cows, dogs, were butchered. Some half-eaten, others simply torn apart. The air hung thick with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid stench of fear. They searched for Daniel for days. Rescue teams, sheriff's deputies, forest rangers, hunters who knew every creek and ridge of these mountains like the back of their hand. They found nothing. Not a trace, not a scrap of clothing, not even a single drop of blood that linked to him. Just the vast, indifferent blank canvas of fresh snow. He had never existed. The guilt was a cold, constant companion for Lucas, a lead weight in his stomach. He had survived, huddled with his mother and sister, cowering in the attic. He had, miraculously, escaped their notice. But the memory of that night, of Daniel's sacrifice, was a raw, festering wound that never quite healed. The town, as small towns do, tried to move on. They patched up the walls, buried their dead, and tried to stitch their lives back together. The stories of the things that had come out of the forest became part of the local folklore, whispered around crackling fires, but never too loudly, never too seriously. Speaking of them too directly, acknowledging their reality, would invite them back. Some claimed they were wild dogs, others a particularly vicious pack of timber wolves. But everyone knew that no wolf, no matter how hungry, did what had been done. This forgotten legend, this unspoken truth, influenced every aspect of their lives. Doors remained locked, even in daylight. Hunters changed their routes, avoiding certain parts of the forest, paths once familiar now deemed cursed. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every shadow between the trees, held a new, chilling significance. Lucas, despite the passing years, still lived under its shadow. Every night, the sighing of the wind through the eaves of his house and the distant hoot of an owl sent a shiver down his spine, too reminiscent of that haunting, drawn-out howl. He found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, a nervous habit he could not shake, expecting to see something monstrous looming in the periphery of his vision. He had learned to live with this constant, low-grade hum of dread, this persistent anxiety that was as much a part of him now as the calluses on his hands. It was the price of survival, the lingering scent of that night, clinging to him like sawdust to a freshly planed board. He scraped and sanded, building furniture, building a life, but always, always with one ear cocked to the silence, waiting for the echo. The morning wore on, the air in the shop growing heavy with the fine dust motes dancing in the slanted light from the high windows. Lucas had buried himself in his work, trying to outrun the tendrils of memory that always reached for him on these late October days. He was shaping the curved back of a rocking chair, the maple wood giving off a faint, sweet smell as the plane peeled away thin, translucent curls. The rhythmic shoosh-shoosh of the blade, the subtle creak of the old floorboards under his weight, these were the sounds that usually anchored him, pulling him back from the precipice of his thoughts. He had planned out his day, a neat mental ledger of tasks. Finish the chair, start on old Mrs. Gable's kitchen cabinet, and get a jump on that custom mantelpiece for the new folks up from the city. Physical labor, he had found, was the best antidote to the mind's darker wanderings. Then came the knock. It was not the hesitant tap of a customer, nor the familiar booming rap of a delivery driver. It was sharp, insistent, and utterly unexpected. 3 quick, heavy thuds against the thick oak of the workshop door, each one echoing with an unnatural resonance in the sudden silence of the shop. Lucas flinched, the plane scraping against the maple with a harsh, splintering sound, ruining the smooth curve he had been so carefully crafting. His heart, already thrumming with the low anxiety that was his constant companion, ratcheted up a notch, a frantic drumbeat against his ribs. The knock felt wrong, out of place. It held no timidity, but also none of the casual familiarity of a local. There was an urgency to it, a strange, quiet demand. He lowered the plane, his hand hovering above the scarred wood of the workbench. For a long moment he just stood there, listening. No further sound. Just the echoing silence, heavy and watchful. His breath hitched in his throat. He had spent 5 years learning to ignore the bumps in the night, the wind's whispers, the creak of old wood. But this was different. This was a deliberate summons, a presence right outside his door. Slowly, cautiously, Lucas moved towards the door, his worn boots silent on the sawdust-strewn floor. He reached the old warped planks of the door, their seams cracked and aged, and peered through a narrow knothole near the latch. He saw a shape, indistinct in the dappled light of the late morning, but clearly human. Not a mailman, not one of the usual vendors. His mind raced, trying to conjure a familiar face, a reason for this unexpected visitor. Nothing came. Taking a deep, ragged breath that tasted of pine and dust, Lucas reached for the latch. The groan of the old hinges sounded unnaturally loud as he pulled the heavy door inward. The morning light, cool and pale, spilled into the workshop, illuminating the figure standing on his porch. For a long, agonizing moment, Lucas's brain struggled to process what his eyes were seeing, the image refusing to coalesce into anything comprehensible. It was a man, tall and lean, his shoulders hunched slightly against the cold. His face, half hidden by a tangle of dark, matted hair, was turned slightly away. This was not a local. Lucas knew every face in this town, every face that belonged here. This person was a stranger, yet something about him tugged at a deeply buried cord of memory, something that made Lucas's blood run cold. His mind, usually so sharp and practical, worked through thick mud, trying to connect disparate pieces of a puzzle that did not exist. Then the man turned his head fully, his eyes meeting Lucas's. In the half-light of the master's workshop, Lucas tried to make out the features, the gaunt cheeks chapped and reddened by prolonged exposure to bitter cold, the lips cracked and pale. And those eyes, they were not quite right, and then it hit him. A wave of ice-cold shock, so profound it stole his breath and made his knees buckle. It was a recognition so absolute, so undeniable that it shattered the carefully constructed walls around his memories, ripped open the old wound, and poured salt into it. It was Daniel, his brother, the one who had vanished into the blizzard 5 years ago, leaving nothing but silence and blood. But it was not Daniel. Not the Daniel he remembered. Not the boy with the easy grin and the restless energy. This was a spectral figure, a nightmare given flesh, something resurrected and twisted by unspeakable things. The changes were stark, horrifying. Daniel's face was pale, almost translucent. The cold had burned every trace of life from beneath his skin. His hair, once a sandy blonde that caught the sunlight, was now several shades darker. A dull, lifeless brown that absorbed the light rather than reflected it. His skin, visible on his hands where his torn sleeves ended, was not soft and youthful as Lucas remembered, but rough, almost leathery, with a strange, almost imperceptible texture, hardened by years of exposure to the elements and something far worse. And his eyes. They were still Daniel's eyes, the same shape, the same set in his gaunt face, but the color had shifted. They were no longer the clear, bright blue of his youth. Instead, they held a faint, unsettling luminescence, a soft, amber glow that pulsed in the dim light of the shop. He was dressed in a winter jacket, heavy and ripped, so badly torn in places that Lucas saw patches of raw, dark hide beneath. The jacket reeked. It was the smell that truly unsettled Lucas, an unsettling combination of damp earth, mildew, and something else. A metallic tang like iron, the smell of fresh blood, as Lucas's mind screamed. He could not place it, could not quite define it, but it was a smell that prickled the hairs on the back of his neck, a scent of wildness and decay. Daniel's lips parted, and a single phrase, raspy and quiet, emerged from his throat. "I'm back." His voice was unfamiliar, rough and strained, unused for a very long time, but it was unmistakably Daniel's. There was no joy in it, no relief, no sound of a prodigal son returned. Just a flat, unnerving calm. And then another sentence, delivered with the same chilling detachment. "But we need to leave. Tonight, they will come." He did not rush forward to embrace Lucas, did not shed a tear, did not show any of the emotion Lucas had imagined for years would accompany such a reunion. This cold, almost clinical distance was more terrifying than any monster, for it meant that the boy he remembered, the brother he loved, was truly gone, replaced by this chilling, unknown entity. Lucas's mind reeled, grasping for purchase, desperate to deny the impossible truth. This was a trick, a cruel hallucination brought on by his own tormented memories. Daniel suffered from shock, amnesia, and a profound psychological break from the trauma of his disappearance. He had been found by some reclusive mountain cult, starved and brainwashed, and this was a twisted form of indoctrination. This was not Daniel at all. A doppelganger, a cruel impostor who knew too much. He tried to search for a logical explanation. Any explanation that would make sense of this impossible reality. But deep down, in the core of his being, a cold, unshakable certainty solidified. This was Daniel. And this knowledge, this utterly undeniable, impossible truth, brought with it a wave of icy, paralyzing terror that stole the air from Lucas's lungs. Lucas, still reeling, managed to close the workshop door. cutting off the pale morning light and plunging them back into the relative gloom. He did not want to be seen. He did not want anyone else to witness this impossible, horrifying reunion. He cleared his throat, the sound rough and dry in the sudden silence. "Daniel?" he managed, his voice barely a whisper. "Where? Where have you been? How did you survive? What happened?" The questions tumbled out, desperate, urgent, like stones rolling down a steep incline. Daniel remained impassive, his amber eyes scanning the dusty interior of the workshop, sweeping over the tools, the stacked lumber, the shadows in the corners. His gaze did not linger on Lucas, did not meet his brother's desperate plea for answers. It was a restless, almost predatory glance. He catalogued every detail, assessing the space. His answers, when they came, were clipped, elusive. "The packs," he rasped, his voice a low, gravelly sound that vibrated in the air. "The laws of the forest." That was it. No more. He offered no details, no stories of escape or survival. He spoke of packs as they were a natural phenomenon, a given, and laws of the forest with an authority that chilled Lucas to the bone. He described a different world, a brutal, wild existence that had nothing to do with the human one Lucas inhabited. Daniel's eyes remained evasive, never quite meeting Lucas's, constantly shifting, sliding away. It was a disquieting habit, making Lucas feel that he himself was being scrutinized, analyzed, rather than engaged in conversation. As the day wore on, Lucas began to notice other unsettling things about Daniel, behaviors that he initially tried to rationalize as symptoms of trauma, a form of shock and post-traumatic stress disorder. Daniel avoided the brighter areas of the workshop. When a stray beam of sunlight managed to pierce a crack in the old wall, slicing across the floor like a golden sword, Daniel recoiled sharply, turning his face away with a low, almost imperceptible hiss. He kept to the shadows, preferring the dim corners of the room. He also stayed far from the windows, moving with a strange, furtive grace when he had to cross the space between his shadowy haven and the back wall. He feared being seen, not by Lucas, but by something outside. When Lucas offered him some dried venison jerky and water, the only food he had immediately available, Daniel took it, but he did not eat immediately. Instead, he brought the jerky close to his face, his nostrils flaring slightly, and sniffed it for a long, unsettling moment, performing some kind of chemical analysis. He sniffed the water too, before taking a tentative sip. When Lucas later offered him a sandwich with leftover roast beef, Daniel pushed it away, his lips curling faintly, a flicker of disgust in his amber eyes. He would not touch cooked meat. Lucas, his mind reeling under the weight of fear and disbelief, found himself shifting into a strange, detached mode of observation, like a detective. He could not process the emotional impact of Daniel's return. He could only analyze. He watched his brother, every movement, every subtle gesture. He noticed the scars first. On Daniel's wrists, peeking out from beneath the ragged cuffs of his jacket, Lucas saw a series of faint, discolored marks. They were not the clean lines of old cuts and scrapes. They were tooth marks. And on the left wrist, a larger, more prominent scar, jagged and ugly, a ragged, torn bite that had healed poorly. Lucas's breath caught in his throat. He tried to get a closer look to examine them, but Daniel, sensing his intent, instinctively pulled his hands back, tucking them into his pockets, his gaze still avoiding Lucas's. Old legends, half-forgotten tales whispered by the elders of the town suddenly roared to life in Lucas's mind. Stories of those who survived the bite, those who were touched by the curse of the wolf, forever changed. He tried to push the thought away, to deny the monstrous implication, but it lodged in his mind like a splinter, painful and persistent. News, as it always does in small towns, spread like wildfire. A phone call to their mother, a choked, tearful explanation that Lucas would later regret. Within hours, the entire community knew. Daniel Hale, the boy lost to the blizzard, was back. And with the news came a fresh wave of anxiety, rippling through the already fractured peace of the town. Simultaneously, strange incidents began to occur, adding fuel to the growing unease. The first calls came into the sheriff's office that afternoon. Dogs missing. Not just running off, but vanishing without a trace, leaving only disturbing remnants. A patch of matted fur near a fence. A dark, viscous stain of blood on a porch step. A single, gnawed bone where a pet had been chained. It was not just a few. It was a disturbing number, and the pattern was too consistent. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in bruised purples and grays, thick autumn clouds scudding low over the peaks, the air grew heavy, pregnant with unspoken dread. And then, from the direction of the old cemetery, where the forest began its slow creep towards the town's edge, it came. A sound that ripped through the twilight and plunged Lucas into a cold, immediate panic. It was not the familiar, mournful howl of a lone wolf, nor the yips and barks of a coyote pack. This was a low, drawn-out, utterly chilling sound, a sustained note of pure, predatory menace that vibrated in the very air, rattling the windows of Lucas's workshop. It was so deep, so primal, such that the old houses trembled in time with it. Their very foundations shook. Lucas felt a cold trickle of sweat snake down his spine. It was that sound. The same sound he had heard 5 years ago. The herald of unspeakable terror. Lucas felt himself caught in a tightening vice, squeezed by two distinct pressures. The external threat, the encroaching darkness of the forest, and the chilling howl that echoed through it, was undeniable, palpable. But the internal pressure, the strange, disturbing presence of Daniel, his brother, who had returned as a spectral echo of his former self, was equally, if not more, terrifying. Daniel's bizarre behavior, his evasive answers, the marks on his wrists, his strange aversion to light and cooked meat, all of it pointed to something supernatural, something Lucas's rational mind desperately refused to accept. He clung to the fragile hope that it was merely trauma, a severe case of post-traumatic stress disorder, and a prolonged hallucination. Anything but the truth that hammered at the back of his skull. Night descended fully, heavy and suffocating. The lamps in the workshop glowed, casting long, dancing shadows, but their light felt meager, insufficient against the vast, encroaching darkness outside. Daniel stood silent, almost motionless near the back wall, his head cocked slightly, his gaze fixed on nothing, his ears straining to catch sounds Lucas could not hear. His amber eyes, in the encroaching gloom, glowed even brighter, two faint, unsettling embers in the deepening shadows. Lucas felt an awful certainty building, a creeping dread that they were both standing on the very edge of a precipice, and it would only be a matter of time before they tumbled over into the abyss. Lucas spent the better part of the next morning in a desperate, frantic attempt to rationalize everything. Daniel's gauntness, his strange aversion to light, the peculiar smell clinging to him, These were the hallmarks of a body and mind pushed to their absolute limits. He had been found by some reclusive survivalist group, cut off from civilization, forced to live off the land in a brutal, unconventional way. A cult, as he had desperately considered, one that practiced bizarre rituals and imposed strange dietary restrictions. He tried to coax old memories from Daniel, to jog his mind with shared jokes, family stories, specific details from their childhood. "Remember that time, Daniel, when Mom hid all your Halloween candy?" he asked. "Do you still have that old baseball glove? The one with the broken laces?" But Daniel remained an enigma, his responses a low mumble and a blank stare. Those memories belonged to a stranger. He was an empty vessel, or a vessel filled with something new and alien. Later that afternoon, driven by a gnawing need for answers, Lucas decided to brave the forest. He told his mother he was checking his traps, a flimsy excuse she did not question. He walked with his old hunting rifle slung over his shoulder, the familiar weight a small comfort against the prickling fear. The air in the woods was colder, stiller, the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves more pronounced. He looked for anything, any sign that confirmed or denied his most terrifying suspicions. He found them, not immediately, but as he moved deeper, leaving the familiar logging paths behind, they began to appear. Tracks. Not the precise, neat prints of a wolf, no matter how large. These were bigger, impossibly so, with something undeniably human about their stride, yet clearly ending in paw-like indentations. He saw trees, ancient pines with their bark stripped away in long, ragged gouges, reaching impossible heights. Something monstrous had stood on its hind legs and clawed at the trunks, and the remains. Not merely deer or rabbit carcasses. These were smaller creatures, squirrels, raccoons, even a stray domestic cat that had wandered too far from a farmhouse, torn apart with a savage, almost surgical precision. Bones snapped, flesh ripped, blood spattered across the fallen leaves. It was the work of something with intelligence, something that enjoyed its kill. Back in town, the fear was curdling into full-blown panic. The local hunters and farmers, grim-faced and armed, had organized their own informal patrols, venturing out at night in pickups, their headlights cutting through the encroaching darkness. The nights grew increasingly tense. Lucas, huddled in his workshop, heard the distant crack of gunshots, sharp and futile against the deeper roar of the wind. Then came the screams, thin and piercing, from the distant parts of town, followed by the frenzied barking of dogs. The next morning, the stories began to emerge, whispered and horrified. Strange, fleeting shadows seen darting across the edges of properties, animals, not just dogs, but chickens, goats, even a newborn calf, dragged directly from their pens, leaving a trail of bloodied earth and the stench of terror. The town was under siege, slowly, inexorably tightening its grip. Lucas kept a watchful eye on Daniel. Though his brother continued to murmur about the approaching danger, about the need to flee, there was a disquieting absence of genuine fear in his demeanor. Instead, Lucas detected something else, something deeply disturbing. A strange impatience, a grim anticipation. Daniel spent hours at the windows, not looking out with dread, but with an intense, longing gaze. He cocked his head, listening to sounds Lucas could not hear, his nostrils flaring slightly. He caught a scent on the air, something distant and wild. It was the posture of a predator, not a victim. The strange atmosphere of the house began to shift, permeating every corner. The peculiar smell of iron and dampness that clung to Daniel, a scent Lucas still could not quite define, seeped into the very walls, settling in the upholstery, clinging to Lucas's clothes. It was a rank, wild smell, something ancient and animalistic. At night, Lucas lay awake, his heart pounding, listening to Daniel move. He was utterly silent, a specter in their own home. No creaking floorboards under his weight, no rustle of clothing, just a soft, almost imperceptible displacement of air. Daniel did not sleep. If he did, it was in short, deep bursts that refreshed him unnaturally. His wakefulness was relentless, supernatural. His senses were constantly attuned to something beyond Lucas's comprehension. A new, colder fear began to bloom in Lucas's chest. Paranoia. He started to feel unsafe, even in his own home with his own brother. He questioned why Daniel had not left the forest earlier, despite his stated desire to warn them. Why now, when the threat was no longer distant but imminent, breathing down their necks? What was he truly waiting for? The questions circled Lucas's mind like hungry vultures, each one gnawing at the fragile thread of his sanity. One evening, as the last vestiges of daylight bled from the sky, Lucas came across Daniel standing by the living room window, staring out at the darkening street. His brother's back was to him, his posture rigid, alert. As Lucas approached, Daniel slowly turned his head. And in that moment, illuminated by the dying light, Lucas saw an expression that froze his blood. There was no horror in Daniel's eyes, no trace of the fear that gripped the town. Instead, there was something ancient, something deeply primal and predatory. His amber eyes glowed with an unnerving intensity, fixed on the fading light, on the shadows stretching from the trees. It was the look of a wolf, poised and watchful, patiently stalking its prey. And Lucas, with a sickening lurch in his gut, realized he was no longer a brother, but potential quarry. Driven by the growing dread and the chilling enigma of Daniel's return, Lucas resolved to find answers where he could. The next morning, under the pretense of research for a novel he wrote, Lucas drove the old Ford pickup into the small town's library. The building itself was a relic, smelling of aging paper and dust, with tall, narrow shelves crammed with volumes that rarely saw the light of day. He sought out the small, neglected section on regional folklore and local history, running his fingers along the spines of dusty, leather-bound books and faded paperbacks. He looked for anything that hinted at werewolves, wolfmen, or any other creature that bridged the terrifying gap between man and beast. The information was scarce, buried in oblique references and local legends dismissed as quaint superstitions. Yet, what he found was deeply unsettling. Mentions of ancient curses tied to the land, of people who, through some dark transformation, became irrevocably part of the wild, shedding their humanity like an old skin. One frayed volume spoke of the Greys, spirits of the forest, who walked among men, carrying the scent of the wild with them. It was enough to make Lucas's stomach clench. As he pored over the texts, his mind drifted back to that terrible night 5 years ago, searching for details he missed, anything that made sense of Daniel's impossible return. He remembered the unnatural speed of the creatures, their almost fluid movements, the way they coordinated their attacks with a terrifying preternatural intelligence. It had not been a chaotic, mindless rampage. It was organized. He remembered the way they had moved through the town, not just attacking at random, but as if they searched for something and someone. Daniel had been taken, not just lost. The thought was a chilling echo of the folklore he was now reading. Later that day, Lucas, heart pounding, went to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Miller, a man whose face was permanently etched with the weariness of small-town law enforcement, greeted him with a sympathetic but wary expression. Lucas tried to engage him, to ask about any unusual incidents, about the reports of missing dogs, about the unsettling howls. He sensed a familiar stone walling. Miller just waved a dismissive hand. Just wild wolves, Lucas. Been an increase in their population, that's all. Hungry this time of year. But Lucas knew better. Everyone in town knew better. The sheriff, like so many others, was trapped in the town's collective denial, a desperate attempt to maintain the illusion of safety. Lucas pressed, pushing a little harder than he had to. Sheriff, what about the lists from 5 years ago? The missing. Daniel was not the only one whose body was not recovered. Miller hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly, but the sheer desperation in Lucas's voice swayed him. He pulled out a dusty, yellowed binder, and there it was. Daniel's name marked presumed deceased, body not recovered. But beneath it several other names, people who had vanished that night, leaving no trace. A small knot of dread tightened in Lucas's gut. Daniel was not alone. They had all been taken. Returning home, Lucas found Daniel even more withdrawn, more secretive. His movements were almost completely silent now, a fluid, unnerving grace that allowed him to drift through the house like a shadow. Lucas caught glimpses of him, always at the periphery of his vision. Once, he saw Daniel kneeling by the old stone hearth, hunched over something, his hands moving with a strange, deliberate focus. Lucas paused, watching. Daniel sharpened something against the rough surface of the stone, something long and curved, claws. Before Lucas stepped closer, Daniel sensed his presence. He instantly drew his hands back, tucking them beneath his jacket, his movements too fast, too controlled. He rose and turned, his amber eyes meeting Lucas's with a flash of something Lucas could not quite decipher, a mixture of wariness and something else, something cold and distant. Desperate for any real insight, Lucas decided to approach the old hunters, the men who knew the deep woods better than anyone. He found Jedediah Hayes, a man whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles, sitting on his porch, whittling a piece of cedar. Jedediah, after much prompting and the subtle offer of a good bottle of whiskey, finally spoke in hushed tones, his voice gravelly with age and caution. He spoke of old native legends, of the Greys, beings that were neither true wolf nor true man, but something ancient, something that walked between worlds. He spoke of them as soul eaters, entities that did not just hunt for flesh, but for something deeper, something vital. "They ain't just after your body, Lucas," Jedediah rasped, his eyes fixed on some point in the distant forest. "They're after what's inside you. What makes you you?" Lucas felt a cold, sickening lurch in his stomach. The words echoed the terrible dread that was growing within him, the dread that Daniel, his brother, was no longer entirely himself. As the days turned into weeks, Lucas began to notice a strange, unsettling change in himself. His own sense of smell, usually ordinary, sharpened, heightened. He could distinguish the specific scent of damp earth on Daniel's boots from the smell of old wood in his shop. He could discern the faint, metallic tang of iron and dampness from Daniel more distinctly now. A scent that grew stronger, more pervasive, clinging to the air around his brother like a second skin. He also began to detect other smells, subtle yet distinct, that drifted in from outside. The sharp, clean scent of pine needles, the musky odor of deer, and something else. Something wild and animalistic that made the hair on Lucas's arms stand on end, a smell that was alien and terrifying, yet strangely compelling. It was a smell of primeval wildness, of raw, untamed power, and it prickled his skin not with fear, but with a strange, unsettling awareness. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of coming storm. The last days of October had faded into a cold, bleak November, and the sky had been a bruised, mottled gray for a solid 24 hours. A bitter wind, raw and cutting, howled through the skeletal branches of the trees, tearing at the last vestiges of autumn leaves and sending them skittering across the frozen ground. It pressed against the old house like a physical weight, sighing and moaning through the eaves, rattling the window panes. This weather, this sudden, plunging cold and the oppressive wind-whipped sky was a chilling mirror image of that night 5 years ago. Lucas felt a familiar, terrible dread settle in his gut, heavy and cold as a stone. It was not a premonition. It was a certainty. With the onset of true darkness, the world outside dissolved into a swirling, chaotic symphony of wind and shadow. And then, from the depths of the forest, the howl began. It was not a single, isolated cry this time. It was a chorus, a rising and falling tide of guttural, drawn-out sounds that ripped through the very fabric of the night. It was not just heard, it was felt. It vibrated in Lucas's bones, a deep, unsettling thrum against his ribs, making the very floorboards of his house tremble. Then, closer to the edge of town, the piercing screams began, thin and brittle against the rising cacophony. A single gunshot, then another, futile pops against the overwhelming, monstrous sounds. Lucas's stomach lurched with a sickening certainty. The attack had begun. Panic, cold and sharp, seized the town. He heard the frantic, desperate ringing of his phone. But when he tried to answer, the line was dead. The circuits were overloaded, and the cold had finally done what the creatures 5 years ago had not managed: severed the last remaining lifeline. From the house next door, he heard a woman's high-pitched shriek abruptly cut off. Then a splintering crash that shook the ground, followed by the sickening sound of something massive slamming against the exterior wall of his neighbor's home. Glass shattered with a terrible crystalline sound, followed by a profound, agonizing silence. It was over, just like that. Daniel stood by the living room window, a dark, silent sentinel, his body rigid with an unnatural tension. He did not look at Lucas, his attention wholly consumed by the unseen horrors unfolding outside. His amber eyes, burning with an eerie luminescence in the near darkness, were fixed on the line of trees at the edge of town. His head cocked slightly, straining to discern every rustle, every snarl. There was no terror in his gaze, no trace of the human fear Lucas felt gnawing at his own insides. Instead, there was a strange, grotesque excitement, a terrible anticipation that made Lucas's blood run cold. "They're close," Daniel whispered, his voice a low, guttural murmur that barely escaped his throat. Later, as the full, horrifying weight of the pack's presence settled around the house, the howls and snarls practically vibrating the foundations, Daniel turned from the window. The ambient light from the distant streetlights, diffused by the swirling snow that had begun to fall, caught the strange glow in his eyes. His face, still pale, hardened, setting into a mask of grim determination. "I didn't just run that night," Daniel said, his voice taut, raw with something Lucas could not identify. "I was taken by them." He gestured vaguely towards the unseen horrors outside. "I became part of their pack, lived among them, learned their ways." Lucas stared, his mind struggling to reconcile the gentle boy he remembered with this hardened, otherworldly being. But I kept my mind, most of it. A flicker of something akin to human pain, passed across his face, gone in an instant. The pack, they decided to return to the town. They are here for more than just a hunt this time. And I came back to warn you, to tell you to take Mom and Sarah and run, now, before it's too late. The words tumbled out, urgent, desperate, but still delivered with that chilling, unnatural calm. A bitter, resentful expression twisted Daniel's mouth. "The problem is," he added, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper, "they don't forgive. Not those who betray the scent of blood." He did not elaborate on what that meant, did not explain the chilling phrase. But Lucas felt a cold wave of understanding wash over him. Daniel, by returning, by warning him, had put himself in terrible danger, exposed himself to the vengeful wrath of his adoptive pack. Lucas felt a sudden, sickening doubt. Daniel had not truly betrayed them. This was all part of a larger, more insidious plan. The question, dark and poisonous, began to take root in his mind. The house was cloaked in a deepening gloom, the meager light from the single lamp in the living room barely pushing back the oppressive darkness. Lucas moved on autopilot, his hands fumbling with the deadbolts on the front door, adding extra latches to the windows. He tried to call his mother and sister again, his fingers fumbling with the buttons on the old rotary phone. Nothing. Just a flat, dead line. The silence within the house became deafening, thick and heavy, broken only by Lucas's ragged, uneven breathing and the unnervingly calm, imperceptible breaths that Daniel took, standing motionless by the window, a statue carved from dread. The howls outside grew closer, more insistent, a terrifying chorus that promised an unspeakable reckoning. Lucas felt the walls of the old house closing in on him, the familiar comforting space transformed into a cage. He and Daniel, brothers by blood, now locked together in a fragile fortress surrounded by an invisible yet terrifyingly present enemy. The air between them, already thick with unspoken fears and monstrous revelations, grew even heavier, crackling with a palpable tension. Every creak of the old house, every distant snarl from outside, amplified the silence between them, stretching it taut until it snapped for Lucas. In the suffocating quiet, Daniel began to speak again, his voice still raspy, but now imbued with a strange, chilling authority. He spoke of his life with the pack, not in terms of captivity, but of existence. He described their brutal hierarchy, the unforgiving laws of the forest that governed their every move. He spoke of how they survived, how they hunted, the gruesome details of their kills, delivered with a detached practicality that made Lucas's blood run cold. He spoke of why they had not returned to the town for so long, mentioning a leader, an entity he called the Ancient One, whose will was absolute, whose decision alone dictated the movements of the pack. "He is old," Daniel murmured, his eyes distant, fixed on the swirling snow outside the window. "Older than any tree in this forest. And his hunger, it never dies." He spoke of this ancient being with a mixture of reverence and grim acceptance, describing a natural force, like a river or a mountain, rather than a monstrous, sentient predator. Lucas could not reconcile this. Though Daniel had retained his human mind, he remained utterly bound, loyal to this pack of nightmares. It was a curse, Lucas realized, as the old legend suggested, a magical compulsion that warped his will. It was also a monstrous form of Stockholm Syndrome, a twisted psychological dependency born of prolonged terror and isolation. Daniel sensed Lucas's unspoken questions. He spoke of the necessity of the pack, of the order he had found in the raw, brutal wilderness, an order that was more coherent, more true than the fractured, fearful existence of the town. "There is a purpose," he rasped, his eyes burning with an unsettling fervor. "A design, and we are part of it." It was a horrifying philosophy, a chilling justification for unspeakable acts, and it terrified Lucas more than any physical threat. The howls now were no longer distant echoes. They were right outside, a guttural, terrifying chorus that vibrated through the very foundation of the house. Lucas heard the frantic scratching of claws against the wooden siding, the heavy thud of bodies hitting the walls. Shadows, fluid and impossibly fast, flickered across the frosted glass of the windows, indistinct, yet undeniably massive. Lucas caught glimpses of eyes, burning points of light in the shifting darkness, reflecting the faint glow of the lamp within. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, he snatched up the old hunting rifle that Daniel had brought into the house, a relic from their father's hunting days, its worn stock familiar in his trembling hands. But as he gripped the rifle, Lucas noticed something profoundly disturbing about Daniel's posture, the way his brother held himself, not with the defensive stance of one under siege, but with a strange, coiled tension. Daniel was not aiming at the windows, not at all. He held the rifle loosely, casually, his amber eyes still fixed on Lucas, not the shadows outside. He aimed not at the unseen horrors beyond the walls, but at someone within the confines of the house, at Lucas. The thought, cold and sharp as a splinter of ice, pierced Lucas's rising panic, replacing it with a fresh wave of terror. Daniel had truly gone mad. He was about to turn on his own brother. Lucas's voice, when it emerged, was a strangled croak. He clutched the rifle, its cold metal a faint comfort in his trembling hands. "Daniel," he choked out, "what are you doing? What are you waiting for?" Daniel remained silent, his gaze unwavering, those burning amber eyes sweeping over Lucas, assessing him, measuring him. He took a slow, deliberate step towards his brother, a movement that sent a fresh wave of dread through Lucas. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, taut with unspoken threat. Then, the house began to shake. Not a tremor, but a violent, shuddering impact that rattled the very timbers. From outside, Lucas heard a chorus of furious snarls, followed by the sickening sounds of wood splintering, of nails screaming as they were ripped from old boards. Something massive, impossibly heavy, slammed against the side of the house, shaking the foundation, sending a shower of plaster dust drifting from the ceiling. The old oak front door, which Lucas had so carefully barricaded, began to groan, a long, agonizing shriek of tortured wood. An immense, unseen force battered it down. The house was no longer a fortress. It was a crumbling shell. And Lucas, trapped inside, knew their time was running out. The house was truly under siege. Lucas heard them now, not just the howls, but the heavy thud of their bodies against the outer walls, the tearing, scraping sound of claws against wood, the guttural snarls that vibrated through the floorboards. He gripped the old hunting rifle, his knuckles white, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. He peered through the tiny gaps in the drawn curtains, desperate to catch a glimpse of the enemy, to put a face to the horror that surrounded them. But all he saw were shadows, huge and indistinct, flickering with impossible speed across the yard, dark blurs against the falling snow. The terror of the unknown was worse than any concrete image. He knew they were monstrous, but the inability to see their full, horrific forms only amplified the dread. Daniel stood motionless, a silent, unblinking sentinel in the dim light of the living room. His body was a study in coiled tension, every muscle taut, every nerve alert. He did not make a move to help Lucas reinforce the windows, did not show any outward signs of panic. He simply waited, his head cocked, his amber eyes fixed on the door, on the point of impact. His absolute stillness, his unnerving calm, was more unsettling to Lucas than the cacophony outside. It was the composure of a predator, not a terrified human. The attack was not merely physical, it was a psychological onslaught. The howls shifted, becoming not just sounds of aggression, but prolonged, agonizing wails that were designed to strip away sanity, to freeze the blood in Lucas's veins. They were sounds of profound agony mixed with triumphant menace. The scratching against the walls intensified, a hideous grating symphony of wood and claw, 1,000 tiny, maddening sounds that crawled beneath Lucas's skin. It was a calculated torture, designed to break their will, to erode their courage before the final breach. Lucas pressed his hands against his ears, but the sounds penetrated through bone, echoing in the hollows of his skull. Lucas felt the rising tide of panic threaten to drown him. His hands, clutching the rifle, trembled violently, the cold metal digging into his palms. He remembered Daniel, 5 years ago barely 18, running out into that blizzard with reckless courage, trying to draw the things away. Now Lucas was the older brother, the protector, and he felt utterly paralyzed by fear. His mind screamed for action, for some desperate, futile gesture, but his body would not obey. He felt the cold sweat clinging to his skin, the frantic beat of his heart against his ribs. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the horrifying cacophony outside ceased. The scratching, the snarls, the howls, all cut off, leaving behind a deafening, unnatural silence. This was worse, far worse than the noise. Lucas and Daniel both froze, statues in the suddenly silent house, straining their ears, their eyes wide, searching for any sign, any sound. The stillness stretched, taut and agonizing, broken only by the ragged sound of Lucas's own breathing. They waited, and then Lucas smelled it. A strong, cloying, nauseating stench of blood, so potent it made his stomach churn. He looked around wildly, trying to find its source within the house, but there was nothing, no visible wound, no sign of spillage. The smell was coming from outside, seeping in through the cracks around the windows and doors, mingling with the heavy, musky odor of damp earth and wild fur that now permeated the entire house. It was a fresh smell, the unmistakable reek of a recent slaughter, of raw, living flesh torn apart. It coated Lucas's tongue, a metallic, vile taste. In that terrifying, pregnant silence, Daniel slowly, deliberately turned. His amber eyes, in the faint light, reflected not just the lamp's glow, but something deeper, something ancient and deeply sinister. The pupils had dilated, almost entirely eclipsing the amber, giving his gaze a cold, depthless quality. He raised the hunting rifle, the one he had brought into the house, slowly, with a chilling precision. And he aimed it, not at the shattered door, not at the unseen horrors outside, but directly at Lucas. Daniel's movement was agonizingly slow, deliberate. The old hunting rifle, its barrel glinting faintly in the meager lamplight, rose with an unnerving steadiness, pointing directly at Lucas's chest. This was not a gesture of fear, not a fumbling attempt at self-defense in the face of an encroaching horror. It was a cold, calculated action, precise and utterly devoid of hesitation. Lucas's breath hitched in his throat, a painful, rasping sound. His own rifle, clutched in his trembling hands, felt suddenly heavy, useless. He could not believe it. His own brother, the one he had mourned for 5 years, the one he had hoped would bring some answers, some solace, was now aiming a weapon at him. Words caught in his throat, choked by a sudden overwhelming wave of betrayal and terror. This was a nightmare far worse than any monstrous creature from the woods. This was an intimate, personal horror, a knife twisted deep into the heart of his family. Daniel broke the suffocating silence, his voice now entirely devoid of the previous raspiness, smooth and cold, with an unnerving steel-like resonance. "You smell like them," he said, his eyes, still burning with that unnatural amber glow, fixed on Lucas. It was not a question, but a statement, a chilling accusation. "You were in the forest last night, weren't you?" The words hit Lucas like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. "You smell like them." Daniel's strange behaviors, his aversion to light, his refusal of cooked meat, his heightened senses, his silence, his secretive movements, the raw, ugly scar on his wrist that was a bite mark. And then, his own strange changes, the sharpened sense of smell, the subtle tingling beneath his skin, the inexplicable bursts of strength he had felt in the past few days, which he had dismissed as adrenaline. The pieces of the terrifying puzzle began to fall into place, not with a gentle click, but with the shattering force of a falling anvil. He remembered that night, 5 years ago. It happened again. The chaos, the screams, the fleeting moments of desperate flight. He remembered being knocked down, something large and heavy slamming into him. He remembered a searing pain in his side, a burning agony that he had dismissed as a scratch from a branch and a blow from a falling timber. He had simply been grateful to escape, but now, with sickening clarity, Lucas understood. In that very first attack 5 years ago, he had not merely escaped. He had been touched. He had been bitten. The fangs of one of those creatures had pierced his flesh, injecting him with their monstrous essence. He had carried that curse within him all these years, a dormant seed of horror, unaware, unsuspecting. He had lived his life, mourned his brother, clung to his humanity, all while the silent, unspeakable truth festered beneath his skin, waiting for its time to awaken. Now, Daniel's role became chillingly clear. He had not returned to save Lucas. He had not returned as a lost brother, desperate for refuge. He had been a scout, a harbinger. He had come to ensure that Lucas was ready to shed his human skin, ready to embrace his new monstrous nature, ready to join them. All of Daniel's warnings, all his supposed attempts at rescue, had been nothing more than a cunning, manipulative part of the pack's larger plan. He was not a victim, but an accomplice, a guide for his own brother's transformation. The realization crashed down on Lucas like a devastating avalanche, burying him beneath its cold, crushing weight. He was not just a victim caught in the crossfire. He was not just a survivor of a monstrous attack. He was one of them. His own brother, whom he had mourned and longed for, had returned not to bring him home, but to bring him to the pack. The profound, searing pain of betrayal mixed with the icy, paralyzing horror of his own monstrous nature choked him, stealing his breath, rendering him mute. He felt his mind reel, grasping desperately at the last vestiges of his humanity, trying to fight against the unthinkable truth that now pulsed in his veins. A silent scream tore through Lucas's mind, trapped behind his paralyzed lips. His world, the carefully constructed edifice of his life, his beliefs, his very identity, crumbled around him. All the years of struggle, of burying the trauma, of clinging to the hope of Daniel's return, of loving his brother. It was all a monstrous lie, a cruel, intricate manipulation. He wanted to rage, to fight, to scream against the injustice, but his body remained frozen, held captive by the sheer, overwhelming force of the shock. Then a strange, undeniable sensation rippled through Lucas's body. A faint tingling, starting at his fingertips, then spreading rapidly across his skin, a subtle tremor that vibrated deep within his bones. His sense of smell, already unnaturally sharpened, now exploded with an unbearable intensity. The metallic tang of blood from outside, the rank odor of damp earth and wild fur from Daniel, the specific scent of old wood and sawdust in his workshop, all assaulted his nostrils with a vivid, painful clarity. A new hunger, primal and gnawing, stirred in his gut, a deep, consuming craving that had nothing to do with conventional appetite. He felt his own muscles, those he had used for years in his craft, suddenly fill with a raw, unfamiliar strength, a tautness that hummed with latent power. Suddenly, with a deafening crash, the workshop door burst inward, splintering from its frame and slamming against the far wall. Daniel, still holding Lucas at gunpoint, did not flinch. In the gaping maw of the doorway, 5 massive figures appeared, their silhouettes black against the swirling snow and the faint, eerie glow of the distant streetlights. The werewolves. They were immense, larger than any wolf, their bodies thickly muscled, their forms vaguely human, yet undeniably bestial. Steam plumed from their maws, their eyes, burning points of molten gold, reflected the meager light of the lamp within. Lucas saw their fangs, long and gleaming, sharp as razors, glinting in the gloom. But they did not immediately surge forward. They paused, filling the doorway, their massive forms blocking any escape, any path to the outside. They stood there, silent and still, their heads cocked slightly, their luminous eyes fixed on Lucas. There was no aggression in their gaze, no immediate hunger. Instead, there was a chilling curiosity, a profound expectation, and something else, a silent, undeniable recognition. Lucas felt their gaze penetrate him, felt their attention, a physical weight, as they listened to his ragged human breathing, to the frantic thrumming of his heart against his ribs. They read him, assessing him, acknowledging the ancient blood that now pulsed within his own veins. The house descended into a heavy, ominous silence, broken only by Lucas's labored breathing, and the occasional deep, hoarse sounds that rumbled in the chests of the creatures in the doorway. The tension was unbearable, thick enough to choke on. The pack waited, a silent, terrifying jury. A slow, chilling smile spread across Daniel's pale face. There was no warmth in it, no joy, only a cold, profound satisfaction, a grim triumph. He slowly lowered the rifle, the action deliberate, no longer a threat, but a gesture of welcome. His amber eyes, now fully luminous, glowed with an inner fire, a deep, unsettling light that reflected the essence of his transformed being. Something within Lucas struggled, a frantic, desperate battle for supremacy. His human self, the Lucas Hale who built furniture and lived in dread, clung to the last vestiges of his reason, to the memories of his old life, of his family. But the other part, the dormant infection that had slept for 5 long years, now pulsed with a terrifying vitality, responding to the silent call of the pack, to the undeniable, intoxicating smell of their own. He felt a strange, internal pull, a powerful, primal magnetic force, drawing him towards the doorway, towards the shadows. The pack continued to listen to Lucas's ragged breathing, to the frantic beat of his heart. Every inhale, every exhale, every pulse resonated with them, an unspoken language understood on a level far deeper than words. Lucas felt his own breath begin to deepen, to slow, to synchronize with the heavy, resonant breathing of the wares, a strange, terrifying harmony. Daniel took a step forward, closing the distance between them. His face was paler than ever, his features stark, and his eyes blazed with an intensity that was no longer merely amber, but molten gold. "Welcome home, brother," he whispered, and his voice was no longer human, but layered with low, guttural undertones, a resonant growl that vibrated through Lucas's very bones. In that moment, Lucas knew with absolute certainty that his past life was dead. He was not merely losing his home, his family, the small town he knew. He was losing himself. The man he had been, the man Lucas Hale, was dissolving, melting away into the embrace of something ancient, something wild and untamed, something utterly monstrous. The alien blood in his veins responded, no longer a whisper but a roar, echoing the call of the pack. It was more than instinct. It was a profound primeval yearning, a magnetic pull towards his new kin. Lucas felt his body tremble, not from fear, but from a strange, terrifying anticipation, a readiness for the transformation that was about to claim him entirely. He saw in Daniel's eyes not the brother he had loved, but a member of the pack, and in that gaze he found understanding, cold acceptance, and an absolute chilling absence of regret. It was Lucas's final, horrifying farewell to his humanity. He cast a last, lingering glance around his workshop, at the familiar tools hanging on the pegboard, at the half-finished rocking chair on the workbench, at his own hands, which already were strange, alien things. He felt his vision sharpen, the dim shapes in the room resolving with incredible clarity. His hearing, too, became impossibly acute, picking up the faint skittering of a mouse behind the walls, the distant sigh of the wind through the highest pines. The wares in the doorway remained still, their massive forms expectant, unmoving. Daniel reached out, his hand, now rough and calloused, cold but undeniably gentle, closing around Lucas's arm. Lucas did not resist. He let his brother lead him, step by agonizing step, away from the familiar, away from the last vestiges of his human life, and into the predatory darkness that waited beyond the shattered door. The cold wind howled, and Lucas felt the first sharp pain of transformation, a burning deep in his bones, as he walked into the heart of the forest, no longer merely Lucas Hale,